Hi guys, I'm excited to share this DIY video with you today where we'll learn how to make ephemera wall hangings. These pieces are great to add visual interest to any room, and you'll be surprised at how easy they are to make. You'll see that each features antique ephemera accented by a piece of Victorian scrap or whatever other focal piece you'd like, and they all hang by a decorative chain. We're going to get started today with the supplies and the tools that you'll need to make this project. First, pre-cut pieces of plywood. I got mine at Michael's, and they sell them in a variety of different shapes and sizes. Just select whatever matches the look you're going for. Bonus, they come with pre-stained edges, so it's one less thing that we have to worry about. Next, you'll need neutral color paint. I'm not brand specific here, but you'll just want to make sure the neutral colors accent the ephemera you choose well. You probably have some lying around. You'll need Mod Podge, make sure it's matte finish, as well as scissors, a foam brush or paintbrush, and I forgot to show a pen or pencil here. You'll also need a hot glue gun, and don't forget the glue sticks. And one of the most important parts of this project is the chain. Available at any craft or hobby store, choose whatever design you like. You'll need chain cutters, of course, and most importantly is the ephemera you choose. You'll want it to be large enough to cover any of the wood pieces you've selected, and if you plan on making more than one wall hanging, make sure the pieces complement each other. You'll see here that I'm choosing pieces of ledger paper, handwritten paper, music sheets, and book pages. They all work really well together. Then you'll need pieces of Victorian scrap. I always tend to lean towards birds and bird themes, and these pieces are really lovely. They're slightly embossed and add a nice pop of visual interest right to the center of your wall hanging. If you don't have access to Victorian scrap, there is always the option of Dover books, which are available at any Barnes & Noble or on Amazon. These books are prints of antique Victorian scrap. And if you're like me, you'll buy it just to cut apart and use in craft projects. This one's for butterflies, although I've seen them for nautical, bird themes, pretty much anything you can think of. So that's it. We're going to get right into the tutorial. The first step is going to be to create the background of your wall hanging. This should be made using a piece of ephemera that has visual interest all over. You'll see here I'm using a page of a German book that has really great font. I'm deciding here what side should go up and what side should be glued to my block of wood. Once I've made that decision, I'm going to trace around the wood with a pen. You'll also want to be sure that if you're doing more than one wall hanging for the same area, that you're choosing pieces that create visual interest. Once you have the wood traced on the paper, go ahead and trim just inside the pen or pencil lines. Be careful trimming. Remember that you can always go back and trim more if it's too big, but you'll never be able to reattach those old pieces of ephemera if you're too speedy with your cutting. That looks good, and you'll see that this lines up perfectly with my block of wood. There's no overhang, and it will glue nicely. You're going to go ahead and repeat that step with the different pieces of ephemera for however many wall hangings you plan on making, as seen. This was my favorite pieces of ephemera. It's from an old school child's notebook, and it features a whole bunch of different types of calligraphy. I also chose to use a piece of music paper to create some visual interest amongst the set. Next, you're going to grab your Mod Podge. Be sure that you get matte finish. That way there's no shiny or reflective glue popping up in this project. Grab your foam brush, and you are going to very liberally apply the Mod Podge directly to the wood slab. Again, this is liberally. You really can't put too much Mod Podge on, and it will ensure a nice bond between the paper and the wood. Be sure to get the corners really well, because that's where the paper is going to tend to want to pull up at the edges. So you'll want to make sure there's a really good seal there. Once everything is coated, including the corners, go ahead and lay your piece of paper over the top of the wood. You do have time to adjust and slide the paper around if you need to or if you're off with your layout. But don't wait too long. Get it while the Mod Podge is nice and liquidy. Then use your fingers to work out any air bubbles that might be under the piece of paper and make sure that the corners are nice and smooth and affixed to the wood. Lay that aside and go ahead and do your other pieces. Again, you'll see I'm not being shy with the Mod Podge. I'm making sure that everything is stuck on there really well. If you see any air bubbles appear, don't worry. As the Mod Podge dries, everything will get nice and taut and disappear. The next step is to paint the background of your scrap pieces. I've taken the time to decide what I want to glue to the front of each of my wall hangings, and now is the time to paint the background so that the ephemera is covered up with paint to allow the focus to be on the Victorian scrap. The first step is to lay the pieces on your backdrop, and by doing this you're just noticing how far out you need to paint the white mat that goes below the Victorian scrap. I hope that makes sense. Now I'm choosing the darker of two colors. Each wall hanging is going to have two shades of white. So I'm going to start with the darker and then over that layer the lighter. Now you'll see I'm just going for it. I'm squirting the paint right on my wood piece. If you prefer, squirt the paint on something else and dip from there. This project really isn't about perfection, so I felt comfortable squirting the paint right on the piece. You'll see I'm just fanning it out to the edges, and again, this isn't about perfection, this is about getting the paint on there. As you can see part of the ephemera through the paint, and that's great. You want it to look nice and old and worn. I'm again aligning my Victorian scrap to make sure that I've painted out far enough, and in this case I needed to go back and do a little more. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same step to the other three pieces. Again, I take the time to line up my Victorian scrap where I intend on placing it for the final piece and taking note of how far out that white paint needs to go. Then I go ahead and squirt it on the wood background and fan it out. You'll see that I do have some air bubbles happening, but again, when everything dries, it's going to become nice and tall. I'm repeating the steps for the final two pieces. Then you'll want to let that dry, and then we're going to go back and do the same thing with the lighter color paint. However, this time we don't need to align anything, and we're simply spreading that paint out almost to the same point that the darker color was. You'll want to make sure that when you look at these wood backdrops that you see the two colors of paint. Therefore, you're not painting the lighter shade all the way out as far as the darker shade. And hopefully this illustrates that well. There is a lighter and a darker shade on top of the antique ephemera. So again, we're just going to repeat this step on the other three pieces of wood. Done and done. Now we let that dry. This is probably the most fun step. It is gluing the pieces of Victorian scrap to the backdrop. Now that the paint's completely dry, again you're going to lay your pieces on the paint just to get a sense of where you want to glue everything. Then using the foam brush, again you are going to liberally dip into your Mod Podge and apply it to the back of your Victorian scrap or focal piece. This is another case where you want to make sure that things are really covered, especially if your Victorian scrap or focal piece has a lot of really dainty edges. You'll want to make sure everything has a great coat of Mod Podge. You'll see the second bird nest is still on my backdrop, and that's to make sure that I am gluing and affixing the first one in the proper place. Then I'm going to go ahead and repeat that process for the second piece of Victorian scrap for this wall hanging. Again, applying the liberal Mod Podge. Man, I love Mod Podge. And then once that's coated, you'll lift it up and apply it to the backdrop. Taking time to set it in place. And you'll see I actually need to scoot this one down, and that's the nice thing about Mod Podge. You have a little bit of working time with it. So once it's scooted, I am using my fingers to press down every little edge that's on that Victorian scrap, making sure that everything is mounted and sealed and stuck perfectly to the wood backdrop. And there you go. You'll see the kind of embossed finish of the Victorian scrap, and that guy is ready to be set aside and dried. I'm going to do the same thing for the other three, again laying everything on the piece of wood before gluing to make sure that everything is going where you want it. And then you'll want to go back and make sure that all of the edges of all of your pieces have stayed nice and securely mounted. Once everything is dried, it's time to add the chain. So grab your chain, unravel it, and we will start by cutting the proper length for each wall hanging. You'll see that I choose the length just based on what I think looks good. I kind of lay it out, assuming that it will be hung on a little nail or peg. And then once I've made the length selection, you go in and cut it with your wire cutters. There's really no right way to do this. Again, this isn't about perfection, it's about being creative and getting it done. So I'm going to select the proper length for all 4 of my pieces. Really easy. If you wanted to be perfect and measure, you could certainly do that, but that's just not my style. So again, making sure that everything is nice and attached, you're going to grab your hot glue gun and apply a little piece of hot glue to one edge. Then you're going to stick your chain on there. Now I'm going to go back with the top of a pen cap and really push those links into the hot glue, making sure the hot glue comes through the links and really encases the chain. Now you do the same thing on both sides, making sure that the chains are glued an even distance from each of the edges. Again, grab that pen cap and make sure the hot glue encases all of the chain. It is that easy, guys. No science to this. Here I'm just trying to show you that the chain is totally encased in the hot glue. That way it is sure not to pop off of your wall hanging, which, by the way, weighs close to nothing. These guys are really light and really easy to hang. So here I am doing that same process to the other 3 pieces. There's a little close-up again. And before you know it, you are done with this project. Once the glue is dry, in a matter of a minute, you are ready to hang these bad boys on a wall. Really couldn't be any easier. Make sure to pull away any of the little glue strings that might linger whenever you use hot glue. And these guys are done. So here's a close-up of the finished pieces. I have to say the fish is my favorite, and I hope you enjoy recreating this project for your home. If you do, please share a picture with me. I'd love to see what you do. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.